Greetings, listeners, and welcome to the very first Network podcast. My name is Lily Barrington, and I'm a Western Cape Network on Disability board member as well as a social media manager. We're beginning this podcast at a critical moment as the City of Cape Town has announced severe cuts to the dial-a-ride service. And these are changes that will drastically limit disabled people's access to work, healthcare, and basic social participation. Only wheelchair users and those with severe walking impairments will be able to use the service and only for trips to and from work. I'm joined today by Jeremy Opperman, a fellow board member. Both Jeremy and I are blind. Jeremy, you can introduce yourself further, but please also talk about your long history with the network and maybe just briefly touch on your time running the disability desk and what that actually even was.
Thanks, Lily, and it's good to be here. So I've been a disability inclusion consultant for the last 26 years. Very shortly after I started my own job in the area of disability inclusion as a result of the Employment Equity Act coming out, I was asked to join the network and to sit on the board. And I've sat on the board of the network 3 times in the last 26 years. My job has entailed me working at every level in the country, in business, private sector, government, NGO, in the area of disability inclusion preparation, disability inclusion essentially, consulting, awareness raising, access, that sort of work. In 2015, I was asked to create the disability desk for the Western Cape province, which I ran for nearly 5 years. And it had never been done before in that way. And it essentially created a place both to be proactive, in other words, to actually make things happen, as well as being reactive, to be a receiver of complaints and of issues. Interestingly, most citizens can't tell the difference between the city and the province. Many people think they're interchangeable, and they're not. So I had very little to do with dial-a-ride at a coalface level. However, I got an enormous number of queries regarding dial-a-ride, and we did have a dotted line relationship with the city from the province. And so I spent a lot of time with the city. Being a disability inclusion consultant also meant that I watched with great interest the evolution of dial-a-ride from pretty much the beginning. So that's by way of my introduction.
Thank you, Jeremy. Cape Talks, Lester Kivit recently spoke with Councillor Rob Quintas about the decision to cut dial-a-ride services. And he made a number of points that I'd like to put to you directly for comment. On subsidies and viability, Councillor Quintas said, we have a 3% cost recovery with dial-a-ride. That means 97% of the service is completely subsidized. Now, Jeremy, what do you make of this? Because all public transport is heavily subsidized, and that's precisely why we pay taxes. DAR users actually pay comparable and sometimes higher fares than other public transport services because they picked up at their doors. So that's fair that they pay slightly higher, perhaps. But do you think that the framing is maybe a little bit misleading?
Yeah, every public transport service in the world is subsidized. Now, 97% is a pretty high subsidy. But as you said, this is not a free service. These people pay. And I think what's significant to explain here is that very many, in fact, I think we can stick our neck out quite safely and suggest that the majority of dial-a-ride users are either unemployed or underemployed. So even the modest sum that they pay, which, as you point out, is comparable to any other public transport service, and in some instances is more than, particularly trains. If you compare dial-a-ride fare to the train fare, a dial-a-ride is way more. Trains are very cheap. Now, that's not a city problem. The trains are owned as a national competency. But the fact is that this is not a free service, and these are people who can ill afford this fare at all, and yet they have to. And that's absolutely accepted by them.
And this is a very good point that you make, because everybody else, seeing as it's comparable fares, gets to decide what they use public transport for. So even if one were to frame it, look, there are many things that dial-a-ride is used for: going to school, going to universities, of course, work
Exactly.
and back and that kind of thing. But it's basic freedom of movement, is it not? To be able to
It
use
is.
your own money to pay for a public service to be able to get to where you want to go. And if that's a social
Yes.
cause, so be it. Nobody questions non-disabled people for
Yes.
that.
And I think what's important to understand here is that able-bodied people have a choice. And they can, if somebody wants to go to a clinic and they're able-bodied and they live in a sub-economic area and they need to go to a clinic and they need to pay for a taxi to get them there. Alternatively, they could catch a Golden Arrow bus. Alternatively, they could catch a My City bus. Alternatively, they could catch a ride with a friend. Alternatively, they could perhaps walk. People with significant disabilities don't have that luxury. And so, one must just bear that in mind that dial-a-ride isn't something that they necessarily wanted. It is a very, very useful. And I think what your point is well made. This is not just about employment. People with disabilities utilize dial-a-ride for work, certainly. Many people go to school with it. Many people go to college with it. Many people go to the clinic with it. They have to book rides to go to the clinic. I know people who go for dialysis. So this is not a nice, um, lovely little service that the city's putting out. This is a lifeline for many people.
So to the next point, on user numbers and eligibility, the counselor said, we have about 2,000 ad hoc users. Then we have a much smaller amount of users who are our intended core market, which is what the service, when it began roughly in 2000, was designed for. Now, he then said the strict criteria are about 200 or 300 users. Now, in reality, if you include those on the waiting list, there are many, many more people who need this service. And to our knowledge, it was never stated that the service was only meant for wheelchair users or people with severe walking impairments. And in fact, one of the early users consulted was blind. How do you see this revisionist framing, and how do you feel
Yeah.
about the ad hoc, why does he speak of ad hoc use for recreational social vision
Okay,
visits, but never mention things like groceries or medical appointments?
so so here's how it works. During the week, you can book a service and you can book it in advance. And so it's expected that they'll pick you up at 7 in the morning and they'll take you to work and pick you up from home, that is, or close to your home, very close to your home very often, and take you to work, and then they'll pick you up at an agreed time. And that's something you don't book for. That's something you book in advance and it's in the schedule. However, ad hoc means that as a member of Dial-a-Ride, those lucky enough to have registered, many, very often right from the beginning, 25, 30 years ago, um, those people are entitled also to make ad hoc journeys. And they can phone the system, must be 48 hours before, and they say, listen, I want to go to church. Is there a vehicle available? Is it possible that I could book? And invariably, the answer is yes, because they're a member. Or they will say, in plenty of time, a week in advance, right, I've got to go to clinic next week to pick up my medication. May I book the service? Now, those are ad hoc as opposed to your scheduled users. So there's your two users. His figures don't add up to what I recall the figures being. Even 15 years ago, the figures were higher. Um, from what I understand, there are over 500 people that use the service daily and schedule. And I'm not sure of the number, ad hoc. Regardless, what's important to understand is they are registered members. So they're very important to understand that is when this service came out, there was almost immediately an oversubscription. Thousands of people flocked to register. And they used to come to your home. Their OT came there to assess your disability. They checked out whether you were eligible. And within a couple of years, there was several thousand people on the waiting list. By 2010, 11, 12, there were 15,000 people on the waiting list. There is no reason to assume that number has gone down. Importantly, several years ago, I recall them saying that there will no longer be any more applications at all, and they just stopped the applications. So what's important about that waiting list is that demonstrates a demand. This is actually a very simple supply and demand equation. There is clearly a demand. You only have to look at the waiting list to prove that. Those lucky enough to be accepted were able to utilize the facility in its various ways over the last couple of decades. But one must not take one's eye off the ball of the actual waiting list.
To your point of the almost 30 years, the city themselves said in a 2010 article that the service was established in 1995. There is a Dial-A-Ride user who contacted us who said that she, as a blind woman, used the service to get to a medical appointment in 1998. And again, then you are saying that they assessed users for eligibility. How are they going to be assessing it now, I wonder? Decided on the criteria and of what is severe enough, and also
Well,
how
a
is it
very
going to
good
be
question.
policed?
That's a very good question. That's a very subjective answer too. It's a very subjective issue because um, who does assess? Now, in the very beginning, the deal was made that occupational therapists who either were employed by the service provider themselves or they were somehow contracted in, and I think they were associated with partners of the original project, possibly even attached to APD, Association of Persons with Disabilities, who were one of the original partners in the game. It doesn't matter who they belong to. They assessed one. And on a criterion, do you require this? And blind people were not excluded. Some blind people felt that they didn't need to belong to Dial-A-Ride because they were comfortable public transport users. What is very interesting to remember about that is that it's one thing living in a leafy suburb and walking from your station to your home in the afternoon. It's quite another if you live in a dangerous area and you're a woman and you're walking from the nearest bus station or taxi rank to your home as a blind person. You're far more vulnerable. And so many blind people chose to belong to Dial-A-Ride because of that very issue. And one cannot fault them. And one has a right to safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I can speak to that as a blind woman myself. I have been robbed. I suppose that I can say that I was fortunate that I had my phone stolen and nothing worse. So I absolutely understand
Exactly.
your point here. Yes. So Councillor Quintas mentioned e-hailing services, including Uber Assist. And furthermore, he also mentioned the My City Bus, and he said, while it is a limited footprint, but growing, that is a universally accessible system. Jeremy, we know the reality. My City hardware often fails. E-hailing is extremely expensive. Uber Assist vehicles are rare, and many Uber drivers will refuse assistance dogs despite policy. And then if one were to think about like taxis, for example, they have been known to charge some wheelchair users 3 times the rate because their wheelchair takes up so much space. What do you say to that?
Well, exactly. So that was disingenuous of the councillor to actually refer to these alternatives. They're not alternatives. My City is a wonderful service, but it's what's called a BRT system. Bus rapid transport system. And what happens with bus rapid transport systems is that they run on arterial routes. And so they're wonderful. They run in very it's a terrific service. In the earlier days, it was pretty accessible, but they run on arterial routes, which means that you've got your first and last mile to consider. Now, in non-motorized transport consideration, your first and last mile are essential. So if you live in point A and the bus passes your home at point B, which could be a kilometer away, you have somehow got to make it to that area to catch that. That's not an accessible transport system. It's augmented and it is accessible, but it by no means helps everybody. And this is, although it's cute, it's not actually an accessible public transport system. So that's why I'm saying it's disingenuous to quote my city as being a solution. It's a way to a solution. It's a wonderful service which has some access elements, but by no means is it a universally accessible system. Then what is extraordinary is that we have still to this day, we have 100% inaccessible transport systems. We have an entirely unregulated taxi industry, which has never come to the party from an access point of view. We have the largest bus company in the town that has never come to the party from an access point of view. And in fact, has just launched a fleet of electric buses, and not one single conversation was had about accessibility. And lastly,
That's
we have
Golden
the
Arrow.
trains, and that's Golden Arrow. And then lastly, we have the trains. And they launched 2 years ago, they launched a wonderful new train called the Blue Train or the People's Train. And they kept saying, oh, it's an accessible train. And yes, elements of the carriages are accessible inside for the blind and for the deaf. It's wonderful. But there's no such thing as an accessible train on its own. Unless it talks from an access point of view to the station, and the station talks to the road, that's not an accessible solution. So the train might be deemed accessible, but unless it in fact engages with the station and the road accessibly, that's not an accessible solution. So we've moved nowhere, actually. My city has augmented, as I said, but by no means solves the problem. And then, as you pointed out quite rightly, e-hailing did not exist in the early days. And I must point out that e-hailing has changed our lives as blind people, as people with marginal physical disabilities who can use the assistant service. It's true. And for ad hoc trips, it's wonderful. But if you try to commute daily on e-hailing, you'd go bankrupt, especially if you were underemployed.
I can actually speak to that in that I have gone through long periods of unemployment and had to Uber to and from interviews with money that I did not have. And I've also literally left a job because I could no longer afford to get to and from work because the colleague with
Exactly.
whom I used to get lifts had moved,
Exactly.
had moved and could no longer lift me. I literally had to leave that job.
Yep.
But Jeremy, but there was an audit that happened on my city buses, and Anthony, our colleague, had a specific experience as a
Yes.
wheelchair user. Can you just speak to that briefly, just
Yes, I
from
can.
what
And
you
it's a
know?
it's quite an interesting example because when my city first came out around 2010, and to coincide with the Football World Cup in 2010, um, a lot of attention was paid to their credit, to the city's credit. A lot of attention was paid to accessibility. They hired and contracted qualified access consultants to guide them. Many mistakes were averted, and to a great degree, the little stations that the bus comes to were accessible. The station talked to the bus, and to a large degree, that it was a successful engagement from an access point of view. However, as the routes have expanded, the city has lapsed somewhat in terms of engaging with access consultants. And what we're noticing, and this is categorical, what we're noticing is that there's an increasing number of inaccessible stations that the bus stopped at. Now, the story you're referring to was our colleague, Anthony Galino, who's a quadriplegic, did an audit with several people of the My City service, and he was unable to engage with several of the stations, particularly at the waterfront. Now, this is frankly criminal. There's no excuse for it. There are crystal clear building regulations about accessibility that have been in our country, have been baked into our building regulations for 40 years this year, and yet we're still building inaccessibly. So that's just sloppy. Yeah,
You just make an interesting point about the fact that it's the waterfront. That is a number one tourist destination. Imagine a wheelchair user
precisely.
from a different
Precisely.
country. How
Yeah,
embarrassing would that be for us?
absolutely. Absolutely.
So Councillor Quintas said, aside from engaging with certain networks, some of the networks, sorry, engage that speak for persons with disabilities, I have also emailed the National Minister for Social Development. We sent off 3 emails in the past several months. We have elicited absolutely no response. Um,
Mm.
but if this was brewing for 2 years, why was it never raised in our meetings with the city? Because we have a long-standing relationship with them. Why did we have to find
Well,
out through the media? And also, honestly, 3 emails, is that a real attempt at intergovernmental
no,
engagement?
I was staggered when I heard that on the radio. If I was Rob Quintas, I would never have admitted to that. Three emails in a couple of in a year or so is by no means exhaustive. Also, I don't know what he was doing emailing the Minister of Social Development. They have very little to do with disability. There's the Department of Women, Children, and Persons with Disabilities might have been useful, although what that department does is no one really understands. But I don't understand why he would even email them. I don't know what he was trying to get at by doing that. A far more important email would have been to plead to the Department of Transport to increase their subsidy or to increase in some way their support. The other question is on consultation. And in his interview, he said that this has been an ongoing process for the last couple of years, and there's been a great deal of consultation. Now, you and I both know that that's simply not so. Um, we have done some exploration and investigation, and we have yet to find a single entity who has spoken to the city about this calamitous decision that they're making. The city has had a very close relationship for the last 2 years, ironically started by himself in his office 2 years ago, with the network, where we have an integral, what do they call it? It's a transversal universal access committee. And we have had the most extraordinary engagement with that committee.
No, I'm saying we had a very positive experience with them.
We have a very positive experience with that committee, not necessarily with the city.
Yes.
But I think this is I must tell you there's history here because when Dial-A-Ride was first begun, there was actually quite a lot of consultation between the various partnerships. There was a well-known civil engineering consultancy that brokered and facilitated much of the discussion. There were at least two big NGOs and the network itself. And what was born from those discussions and those deliberations was in fact Dial-A-Ride. What happened quite quickly after that is that the doors closed, and the city, on the one hand, and Dial-A-Ride on the other, have had a consistently tight and opaque closed door policy around dealing with Dial-A-Ride. I could get into Fort Knox easier than actually get to the manager of Dial-A-Ride. Even when I was an official myself, a duty-bearing official myself in the province, I struggled to get interviews with Dial-A-Ride's management. Um, and so there's a long history of non-engagement, non-discussion. They would have forums or they would have meetings, but they would talk to the people. They didn't listen to the people. And unfortunately, this is a pattern that we've seen over the last couple of decades of non-consultation, where decisions are made without the real partnership and the collaboration of the NGOs.
Well, yes, Jeremy, you make a very good point because notification is not consultation. And what happened, at least in terms of the blind users, was hardly even notification. They received hard copy letters that they cannot read.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is classic. This is the trouble with a big institution. A city is not an easy place to run. It's an enormous institution. It's a big city. It's a highly complex machine, and so it's completely likely that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. And I've seen this happen before, by the way. In about 2012, 2013, around there, I stand to correction. Give me a year either way. There was a very similar thing. There was an announcement that all Dial-A-Ride users would have to re-register. And I must tell you, there was a massive outcry, and they backpedaled. And it was an arbitrary decision, and this is what we're seeing. This is an arbitrary decision, and not sufficient thought has been put to this decision. Certainly not sufficient consultation, discussion, um, has been shared, has been put to this decision at all. This is an arbitrary decision. And it's an irresponsible decision.
Right. So thank you, Jeremy. Those are all really very good points. Now, on the question of reconsidering hospital trips, because Lester asked about that in particular, Councillor Quintas said, we are more than open if we are able to receive more assistance from any quarter. We would be willing to revise the decision as it stands now. Now, if they were open to assistance, why didn't they consult us earlier? And couldn't NGOs have helped with solutions if we'd actually been brought in? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that speaks to what I pointed out earlier about the lack of consultation. The city has had a policy of shut up and listen for many years, and so they don't particularly engage um, with alternative ideas, with innovative ideas, with solutions, perhaps, because they don't listen, because they don't ask. And so the net result is that they're making a decision, they're making an ill-informed decision arbitrarily without actually looking properly at the situation. And your original point was, to say, okay, that's only for people who are employed. Well, I think what you'll find out is that the majority of dial-a-ride users don't use dial-a-ride for jobs, they use it for alternative. That doesn't make it wrong. Many of those go to school, many of those people go to college. Many of those people go to internships and learnerships. Some of those people go to hospitals, either in a scheduled way, like dialysis, or in an ad hoc way. They surely have that right. Now, to take that away from someone arbitrarily, without warning, without consideration, without discussion, you're quite right. The NGO sector might very well have been able to apply its mind in a collaborative way with the city to find solutions. I think it's also important to point out that this service has never been intended to be permanent. There's always going to be a temporary solution. There was always an interim, as they put it back then, a couple of decades ago. By then hoping that by some miraculous way there would be an alternative accessible public transport system. Now that hasn't happened for many reasons, not all the city's fault. But the point is that we are we're sitting with a situation. The definition of torture is cruel and unusual. You cruel and unusual practice on an individual. To say to somebody suddenly you can't go to your clinic, you can't go to dialysis, you can't go to your church, you can't go visit your sick sister every Sunday or your mother, is to my mind cruel and unusual. And I think this comes from not thinking this thing through.
So, Jeremy, on reporting broken infrastructure on my city buses, the councillor had the following to say. When that happens, if you could please WhatsApp me the bus number, the route, so that we can investigate. All that is required is to be told to us so that we can make immediate repairs. Now, this strikes many as tokenistic. Realistically, which disabled user is going to WhatsApp a councillor, assuming that they even have his number? Lester does, but not the users, while stranded at bus stop. Even if they did, they'd still be stuck waiting for the next bus, and that might also be inaccessible. And the thing is that users already do report faults through official channels, and there is no resolution. So does this reassure you at all?
No, once again, I thought that was a silly statement. There is a perfectly good, there's a toll-free number to call, 0800 65 64 63. And that number is surprisingly responsive, actually. And I did it once. I remember standing on the side of Salt River Road, having just visited Cape Town Society of the Blind, and I was waiting for the My City. And you could hear them because they've got a high-pitched Volvo engine, which makes a strange and a distinctive noise. And so I knew this thing was coming down the road. And it saw me there with my guide dog at the My City bus stop. Well, it must have seen me, unless the driver's blind as well, and sailed past me. And I was enraged. I missed an important meeting as a result of that. And I immediately phoned 0800 65 64 63. They were very good. I got an email within a day. There was an apology, and they said that they would discipline the driver. It was excellent. So there is already a system, as you pointed out, though. So what we must just give the context of that statement was Lester from the radio station pointed out that very often the ramps don't deploy and that the technology doesn't always work. And that's when he said, well, WhatsApp me. The point is, though, the individual not being able to get on the bus, or worse, off the bus when he needed to, is more important. There are processes in place to deal with that. I mean, listen, technology breaks. It happens. I mean, I've been stuck on airplanes for hours, so it happens. Um, and there is a process.
Okay, so Jeremy, finally, the city keeps pointing us towards national government. If elected officials themselves weren't successful in lobbying for funds, what makes them think that NGOs will succeed? Um, isn't this passing the buck because they're supposed to be our representatives? And given, as you pointed out, that dial-a-ride was only ever meant as an interim measure until accessible public transport was implemented, this kind of raises the question of if there ever was a real plan to make the mainstream system accessible.
Yes, and of course, the context behind your question, of course, is where the councillor said that perhaps some engagement with NGOs and brainstorming around possible funding opportunities was equally strange, as you pointed out. NGOs are not in the business of public transport, and NGOs are unbelievably vulnerable to funding drama themselves all the time. And it's frankly absurd to um, you have a funny term. What's it? Budget splain. To budget splain to an NGO about
Just for
your
the
budget
listeners,
problem
yeah, just
is
for the
is
listeners,
absurd.
I pointed out on social media that people love to budget slang to disabled people. And, given that we are in DPOs, we have such an intimate knowledge of what it's like to lack budget. You know, you don't have to tell us about budget. We understand that. But given that
Yeah.
we understand that, potentially we could help with solutions.
The councillor did reach out and said he'd like to meet the network.
That is
Um,
true, and we're hopeful about
and
that.
and well, he wrote again today. There's a letter from him today, and he committed that it would be next week. So I suspect we will have a meeting next week um, to discuss this issue. I think the city, frankly, is a little embarrassed by the extraordinary media interest and community interest in this decision. Um, and it's not a positive interest. There has been an overwhelmingly negative um, taint to the response to this. And so I think the city behooves itself to discuss this very quickly and to perhaps reconsider some of the more irrational, arbitrary decisions that they made on the fly. Um, so it's not an ideal situation. I mean, at the same time, we must have credence in that budgets are that money's tight, and national government has never been a great friend to a DA-run city. And so it isn't easy. National government, to be quite honest, and to take the heat off the city for a moment, I think one must never forget that national government here is also extraordinarily derelict when it comes to universal access in every sphere of life, whether it's public transport or schools, um, and everything in between. National government must come to the party more in a more holistic way, in a strategic way. And I feel for the city to a degree because I've watched this thing unfold for a quarter of a century, and it was always going to happen at some level or other. This was never supposed to be a permanent solution. However, that must not be a cop-out. That must not give the city an opportunity to say, well, it's time now, cheers. You've created an expectation, and people's livelihood and lives are quite literally at stake here. And so they need to be very careful how they take this next step.
No, absolutely. I thoroughly agree with you. And the thing is that, yes, absolutely, national government needs to be held to accountability. And a point that was made in Councillor Quintas's response to our initial open letter was that there is no other city in South Africa that is as accessible as Cape Town, but the point must be made that the bar is extremely low. And this is not something that we want to be used to use as a bragging right, surely. But I absolutely understand your point, and I agree with you. It's not an easy matter. The whole
No,
situation is not an easy matter. But given the
no,
severity of it,
no, it
this
isn't.
should have been seen coming for ages before now. There should have been contingency plans, and above everything else, there should have been consultation with us. We are right here. We are willing to engage constructively. We're not only here to criticize, as I'm sure is made evident by this entire conversation that we've just had. You have pointed out multiple situations in which you can understand the city's position. So thank you so much, Jeremy, for joining me, and let us hope that we can come to some kind of favorable resolution for everyone through this discussion.
Thank you, Lily, for inviting me. Been a pleasure.
So in that case, good night, listeners. It was lovely to speak to you for the first time, and we shall certainly be looking into continuing this podcast series, and hopefully next time on a less dire matter.